Boy, howdy, let me tell you what. If you think that the Trump administration knows a goddamn thing about anything, you don't know shit about shit either, buddy. Let me just tell you. And coming from real redneck, and I mean real redneck. Here, let me show you some redneck shit real quick. Pit bull, charcoal grill, chicken vitamins, chickens, fruit trees as far as I can see, by God. The Great Smoky Mountains. I'm a real redneck, by God. If you're simping for these fascists, and you come from Appalachia, your grandpappy rolling in his fucking grave right now, I tell you what. And if you claim to be a redneck, but you don't know about the Battle of Blair Mountain, or the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, you ain't no redneck, buddy. Real rednecks stand in solidarity with all the people. You feel me? Power to the people.
I've been holding Zach's video in my back pocket for months, but there is a new story out from The Intercept that made me feel like, yeah, it's time. Now's the time. I've made a number of videos about Appalachia in particular, about Kentucky and West Virginia, and how they have swung very heavily for Donald Trump, and how that's confusing to a lot of us, right? Because these are parts of the country, coal mining country especially, that has a long history of voting pro-union, pro-Democrat. But in the last 3 election cycles, we've watched them swing more and more and more to Donald Trump, to be indoctrinated, susceptible to the indoctrination of MAGA. Some of these counties went 85% for Donald Trump, but more than 50% of the residents are on SNAP and Medicaid. And I know it's really tempting for us to say, fuck around and find out, well, who'd they vote for? You know what? I hope they get every single thing that they voted for. This is what they picked. Oh, you know what? Racism is expensive. But it's very unnuanced, and I don't think it's helpful to just say that these folks voted purely on racism. That's not what happened. I'll keep beating this drum. It's more complicated than that. And if we want to understand how to dig our whole country out from what we're experiencing right now, I think we have to look at Appalachia and how it is that a population that is historically heavily oppressed by the super rich, with a long history of generational poverty, but an intense commitment to the labor movement, how it is that those folks could swing for Donald Trump. We've got to understand. We've got to continue to humanize, to empathize, and to understand what caused these people to vote for their own oppression, to vote to increase hardship, and to strip themselves of freedom. What happened there? Because it's not as simple as they wouldn't vote for a black woman. Again, for the bazillionth time, Donald Trump, the Republicans, the super rich in this country, they're really, really good at feeding racism, harnessing the racism that exists, stoking it, not just the racism, the misogyny and the internalized classism, and using those 3, right, that little trifecta of fuckery, the patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, using those to control white people in the working class. And if you don't know the history of Blair Mountain and Mother Jones, then maybe I'll cover that in another video. But please understand that Appalachia has a long history of labor organizing, a long history of struggle against the super rich, against corporations, against exploitation. And so it's really baffling to a lot of us how it is that they voted for Donald Trump. And a lot of people have been asking, how do we wake these folks up? How do we help them realize what they've contributed toward the harm that they have done by voting for Donald Trump once or twice or maybe even 3 times? I don't know what the tipping point is. I don't know how it is that people wake up. I think that's very individual. Each person has their own moment where they're like, oh, holy shit. But I spend a little bit of time every day looking at ICE raid videos, ICE abduction videos on Instagram, and I've watched the ones that are happening in Appalachia. And for me, I've been thinking, like, is this the thing? Is this the thing that gets people to wake up? And lo and behold, there is a new piece out in The Intercept that seems to be indicating much the same thing. And I want to share it with you. The piece is entitled, "Real America is Turning Against Trump's Mass Deportation Regime." The piece is by Alan Stevens, again in The Intercept, December 3rd. And I want to share a little bit of this article with you because it seems to echo my initial thoughts on it, but then of course, obviously gives a whole lot more context and information. And I found the piece quite compelling. Everyday Americans in Appalachia and the Southeast show that resisting ICE is becoming the rule rather than the exception. On a chilly evening in mid-November, about 135 people gathered along a highway in Boone, North Carolina, a small Appalachian college town not known as a hotbed of leftist protest. They held signs reading, "Nazis were just following orders too," and "time to melt the ice," and chanted profane rebukes at immigration and customs enforcement agents rumored to be in the area. "They came here thinking they wouldn't be bothered," one Appalachian State University student told the Appalachian at an impromptu rally. "Boone is a small, southern, white mountain town. We need to let them know they'll be bothered anywhere they go." In a region often stereotyped as silently conservative, this flash of defiance was a startling sign that the battle lines of American politics are shifting in unexpected ways. For the past several weeks, the Trump regime has been rolling out a mass deportation campaign of unprecedented scope, one that is now reaching deep into Appalachia. Branded Operation Charlotte's Web, a deployment of hundreds of Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol agents descended on North Carolina in mid-November, making sweeping arrests in and around Charlotte and into the state's rural mountain counties. The effort is targeting the worst of the worst criminal aliens, but the numbers tell a different story. More than 370 people were arrested, and only 44 of them had any prior criminal record, according to DHS. The vast majority were ordinary, undocumented residents, people going to work or school. They were not violent criminals, which underscores that the crackdown is less about public safety than meeting political quotas. Indeed, Trump campaigned on conducting the largest deportation operation in the U.S., vowing to round up more than 15 to 20 million people, which is more than the estimated 14 million undocumented people in this country, and pressuring ICE to triple its arrest rates to 3,000 per day. That was back in early May. Stephen Miller demanded a quota of 3,000 per day. The federal dragnet has already driven ICE arrests to levels not seen in years. Immigrants without criminal convictions now make up the largest share of detainees. Just a reminder that only 5% of folks abducted by ICE have any violent criminal history at all. Skipping down a bit here, kicking the hornet's nest. What officials didn't seem to anticipate was that this crackdown would face fierce pushback, not only in liberal hubs with large immigrant communities like Los Angeles or Chicago, but in predominantly white working class communities. In Charlotte, a city on the edge of the Blue Ridge foothills, activists scrambled to implement a broad early warning network to track federal agents. Thousands of local volunteers, many of them outside the city's political establishment, mobilized to monitor convoys and alert vulnerable families in real time. They patrolled neighborhoods, followed unmarked vehicles, and honked their car horns to warn others when ICE agents were spotted. Acts of quiet guerrilla resistance that Border Patrol's local commander derided as cult behavior. The effort spanned from downtown Charlotte into the rural western counties, with observers checking hotels and Walmart parking lots in mountain towns for staging areas and relaying tips all across the region. By the time that the sheriff announced the feds had pulled out and videos showed a convoy hightailing it down the highway, locals were already hailing it as a hornet's nest victory, comparing the retreat to British General Cornwallis's abrupt withdrawal from the area during the Revolutionary War after being met with unexpectedly fierce resistance. Charlotte's mostly quiet semi-official resistance, dubbed the Bless Your Heart approach for its polite but pointed Southern style, was notable, but the open rebellion brewing in coal country may be even more significant. In Harlan County, Kentucky, a storied epicenter of the Appalachian labor wars, residents recently got an alarming preview of the deportation machine's reach. Back in May, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into the town of Harlan, and armed agents in tactical gear stormed two Mexican restaurants. At first, the operation was framed as a drug bust. Kentucky State Police on the scene told bystanders it was part of an ongoing drug investigation. But despite being carried out by DEA agents, it was an immigration raid. And local reporter Jennifer McDaniels noted that the people arrested and jailed, their cases listed as immigration, had not a single drug-related offense. Once the shock wore off, residents were livid. "We took it personal here," McDaniels, who witnessed the raid, said. Watching their neighbors being whisked away in an unmarked van with no real explanation from authorities rattled the tight-knit community. "I don't like what these raids are doing to our community," McDaniels continued. "Our local leaders don't like what's going on. We just really want to know what's happening, and nobody's telling us." It turned out at least 13 people from Harland were disappeared that day, quietly transferred to a detention center 70 miles away. In Harland, immortalized in song and history as Bloody Harlan for its coal miners' uprisings, the sight of government agents snatching low-wage workers off the job struck a deep nerve of betrayal and anger. This is a place that knows what class war looks like, and many residents see shades of it in the federal government's high-handed raids. Blood in the hills. For decades, Appalachia lived with the same lesson carved into the hills like coal mines. When Washington shows up, it's rarely to help. When the mining ended and industry dried up, when opioids ripped through these communities, the federal response has always been too little, too late. When hurricanes and floods drowned eastern North Carolina, both from Matthew in 2016 and Florence in 2018, thousands of homes sat unrepaired a decade later, with families still sleeping in FEMA trailers long after the rest of the country had moved on. After Helene floods smashed the western mountains in 2024, relief trickled in like rusted pipe water, with just $1.3 billion delivered to address an estimated $60 billion in damage. A year later, survivors were living in tents and sheds, waiting for their government to step in. But the federal government's priority is a parade of bodies, arrest numbers, detention quotas, a spectacle of force. And so suddenly, these forgotten communities are lit up with floodlights and convoys. Operation Charlotte's Web saw hundreds of ICE and Border Patrol agents deploy overnight. Help arrives slow, enforcement arrived fast and armored. It only reinforces the oldest mountain wisdom: never trust the government. It's a paradoxical arrangement that to too many working Appalachians is simply untenable. It's a rural area with low crime, one organizer in Boone pointed out, calling ICE's authoritarian sweep disgusting and inhumane. The organizer also said that's the number one conservative tactic, being tough on crime even when crime doesn't exist. In other words, the narrative about dangerous criminals didn't match what people are actually seeing as their friends, classmates, and co-workers are being carted off. To be sure, public opinion in Appalachia isn't monolithic. Plenty of folks still cheer any crackdowns of illegals as a restoration of law and order, but the growing resistance in these communities suggests a profound shift. Class solidarity is beginning to trouble the traditional partisan lines. The old playbook of stoking rural white fears about immigration begins to lose its potency when those same immigrants have become neighbors, co-workers, fellow parishioners, and when federal agents descend like an occupying army, indiscriminately disrupting everyone's lives. This is why I say leaning into our humanity is the way out of this. When the immigrants being snatched are your friends, your neighbors, the folks you go to church with, the parents of your child's best friend, you can't continue to justify what the regime is doing because you cannot dehumanize these folks. When you have relationships with people, it becomes really clear what the government is doing to those people. Abducting a so-called violent gang member at their place of employment is a contradiction, a local Boone resident scoffed. It doesn't take a Marxist to see the underlying reality. This isn't about protecting rural communities, it's about using them for political ends. For many who've been told that they're the forgotten America, the only time Washington remembers them is to enlist them as pawns or body counts in someone else's culture war. And increasingly, Appalachians are saying no. Appalachia has a long, if overlooked, tradition of rebellion from below. A century ago, West Virginia coal miners fought the largest armed labor uprising in U.S. history at Blair Mountain. Coal miners' labor uprisings, and particularly Blair Mountain, is one of my special interests. I'm not a historian, but this is a period in history that I think is so crucial for all of us to learn and connect with. So I'm happy to go into that in a lot of detail in another video, or I encourage you to go read up on it more. Anyway, okay, back to the article. West Virginia coal miners fought the largest armed labor uprising in U.S. history at Blair Mountain, where thousands of impoverished workers, immigrants and native-born alike, took up arms together to stand against corrupt coal barons. In the 1960s, poor white migrants from Appalachia's hills living in Chicago formed the Young Patriots organization, Confederate flag-wearing hillbillies who shocked the establishment by allying with Black Panthers and Young Lords in a multiracial fight against police brutality and poverty. That spirit of solidarity across color lines, born of a shared class struggle, is reappearing in today's mountain towns. You can see it in the way Charlotte activists borrowed tactics from Chicago's immigrant rights movement, setting up rapid response networks and legal support. You can see it in how North Carolina organizers are sharing resistance blueprints with communities in Louisiana and Mississippi ahead of Swamp Sweep, the next phase of Trump's crackdown. The goal is to send 250 agents across the Gulf South, starting now, right now. It's happening right now. And their goal is to arrest 5,000 people. Just indiscriminately, they're going to just go snatch 5,000 immigrants, whether or not those immigrants have done anything wrong. This is all about bounty hunting, right? Let's not forget that for every immigrant abducted, some private corporation, CoreCivic, Geo Group, Team Housing Solutions, they're going to make $150,000, $160,000 a year off of each of these immigrants that they abduct and stuff into a concentration camp detention center. That's our tax money, by the way. That's our tax money. And you certainly see it each time a rural Southern church offers protection to an undocumented family, or when local volunteers protest Border Patrol outside their hotels. No Southern comfort for feds. This all puts the Trump regime and any future administration attempt to wage war on Trump-labeled sanctuary cities in an uncomfortable position. It was easy enough for politicians to paint resistance to immigration raids as the province of big city liberals or communities of color. But what happens when predominantly white, working-class towns start throwing sand in the gears of the deportation machine? In North Carolina, activists note that their state is not Illinois. The partisan landscape is quite different, and authorities have been cautious, but it's ordinary people who are finding creative ways to fight back. They are finding common cause with those they were told to blame for their economic woes. In doing so, they threaten to upend the narrative that Appalachia and perhaps the rest of the working class, grit-ridden, forgotten America will forever serve as obedient foot soldiers for someone else's crusade. The resistance unfolding now in places like Boone and Harlan is not noise, it's a signal. It suggests that America's political fault lines are shifting beneath our feet. The coming deportation raids were supposed to be a mop-up operation executed in the heart of real America, far from the sanctuary cities that have defied Trump. Instead, they are turning into a slog, met with 1,000 cuts of small-town rebellions. This is hardly the passive or supportive response that hardliners in Washington have expected from red state USA. On the contrary, as the enforcement regime trickles out into broader white America, it is encountering the same unruly spirit that has long defined its deepest hills, valleys, and backwoods. The message to Washington is clear. If you thought Appalachia would applaud or simply acquiesce while you turned their hometowns into staging grounds for mass roundups, bless your heart. This is precisely what I'm saying. Every action the regime takes, that creates a chance for us to react. Every terrible thing that they do opens up the door for the backlash effect. The regime thought that they were going to crush liberal cities. They were going to come in and get us to lay down. They were going to attack LA and Chicago and Portland and DC, and that we were all going to fold, except we're not. We're coming up with new, adaptive, innovative tactics to resist. And so they thought, okay, we'll pivot to the parts of America that voted for Trump. Will pivot to these areas that are very white, and they'll be grateful that we come in and snatch their immigrant neighbors. But it's not working out that way. It's not working out that way for them, because everywhere they go and they try to implement authoritarianism, every community who just thought that the immigration raids and the resistance was happening in these blue cities like Portland and Chicago, when it comes to their back door, when it's their neighbors, when it's their coworkers, when it's the folks they go to church with who are being snatched, all that does is turn people against the regime. All that does is grow the resistance. The repressive, cruel, illegal, inhumane things the regime is doing are backfiring. They are mobilizing people to resist. This is what I'm saying. It's not that simple when it comes to Appalachia. These aren't just uneducated racist hillbillies. These are people who voted for Donald Trump, because of the long history of neglect and exploitation that they have experienced. And now they're realizing what they voted for, and they're not going to go along with it. They're not going to stand for it. It turned out at least 13 people from Harland were disappeared